A small manor in Devonshire stood upright in a state that was somewhat neglected, yet not entirely fallen into ruin, much like its mistress. The Ashworth family lived within a truth that everyone in the surrounding area knew, yet no one openly spoke. The money had long since gone, the pride had not. In the narrow space between those two, in the final breath of vanity, Clara Ashworth had grown up. Her mother, Eleanor Ashworth, had held one unshakable belief throughout her life: a woman's worth was measured by the name of the man she married. She had never questioned this belief, because to question was to doubt, and doubt was one of the luxuries Eleanor Ashworth never permitted herself. Especially in matters concerning her daughter. "Clara," she would often say over breakfast, gazing out of the window as though observing a vast world rather than a modest country garden, "your beauty is your only capital. Use it well." Clara had heard this sentence so often that it had nearly dissolved into background noise, the sort of thing said during the day but never truly heard. And yet, if one looked into her mother's eyes, there was always a serious fear beneath it. Not a fear for her daughter's future, but for her own past. For the account of choices once made, or not made, in her youth. Clara had understood this very early. And with that understanding, she had both loved her mother deeply and grown very far from her. Her father's library was small, but full. Clara could never know what Thomas Ashworth would have said to her had he lived. He had gone when she was 8, leaving behind only his voice in memory and his books. But the books remained. And they gave Clara something her mother never had, the sense that questioning was a virtue. She had learned Latin. No one had taught her, she had taught herself, from her father's old grammar book, making mistakes, correcting them, repeating. She had read the French Revolution, then the texts that criticized it, then the texts that criticized those criticisms. For her, history was not memorization but argument, a field of judgments one might agree with or reject, but in which one had to remain intellectually honest. She had told no one any of this. Because the moment she tried, she would see that familiar expression on her mother's face, a mixture of concern and disappointment, the kind that silently asked, "Where will such knowledge take you, Clara?" Nowhere, was what it meant. Nowhere, meaning not toward a suitable marriage proposal. So Clara remained silent. But she did not abandon her books. That year, in the spring of 1815, the small social life of Devonshire stirred with sudden energy. The news traveled from village to village, from house to house, from tea table to tea table. The Duke of Blackmore would be staying at Meryton Park for the summer. Whether at the insistence of his mother, Lady Catherine, or to relieve his own restlessness, whatever the reason, the important thing was this: a young, unmarried duke, with wealth beyond clear measure, was in Devonshire. After this news, every family in the region with a daughter of marriageable age felt a subtle but unmistakable tremor. Eleanor Ashworth felt it more deeply than most. "Duke Blackmore," she said one afternoon, setting aside her sewing as if weighing the significance of the words. "Edward Calloway. 34. Not yet married. How do you know all this, mother?" "Lady Hargrove told me." "Lady Hargrove knows everything." "Yes," Eleanor replied, taking up her sewing again, "which is precisely why one must be careful with her." Clara turned toward the window. There was no wind in the garden. The trees stood quietly. What did she feel about the Duke of Blackmore, at this moment? Nothing. Only that familiar tension in her mother's voice, something that resembled hope, but was in truth fed by fear. The Devonshire ball took place in the second week of June. The assembly was held in the great room of Lady Hargrove's estate, lit with candles, adorned with flowers, and filled with the sons and daughters of the most prominent families in the region. Clara wore the pale blue taffeta gown her mother had chosen. She was beautiful, she knew it, and felt neither pleasure nor discomfort in that knowledge. She carried it simply as a fact. When the room filled, Clara stood beside Lady Hargrove, greeting familiar faces. In one corner, Madame Duval made her presence known, a woman inflated with a certain vanity, forever correcting others, and often incorrectly. In another, Sir William Lucas spoke in a tone calibrated solely to express his own importance. And at the center, surrounded by a space people unconsciously left around him, Edward Calloway. Clara did not search for words to describe him. He was not dark, yet he gave the impression of darkness. Not conventionally attractive, yet undeniably compelling. From the moment he entered, people inclined slightly toward him, and he seemed either not to notice, or to choose not to. Clara watched him for 8 seconds. Then she looked away. The Duke, however, did not see Clara. Or at least, for that moment, it appeared so. 2 days passed after the ball. Clara had gone to Lady Hargrove's library to return a book, one of the richest collections in the region, and a place Clara used as a quiet, unofficial refuge. She placed the book back on its shelf, glanced around, and then noticed a familiar title, the second volume of Gibbon's work on the decline of the Roman Empire. She reached for it. At that exact moment, another hand reached for the same shelf. Clara withdrew. The man did the same. They looked at one another. It was the Duke of Blackmore. Alone. No valet at his shoulder, no companion beside him. And on his face, there was an expression Clara had not expected, a faint surprise. Perhaps at finding someone else reaching for the same book. Perhaps at who that someone was. Gibbon, Clara said, unnecessarily, not to fill the silence, but simply to confirm it. Gibbon, the Duke repeated. His voice was different from the one he used in the ballroom. Lower. Less performative. The second volume, Clara said. Have you read the first? A brief pause. Yes. So have I. Clara took the book. Then I shall keep this. You may return to the first. And she turned, walking toward the door. Duke Blackmore remained standing in Lady Hargrove's library, watching the woman who had just left. No one in this region had ever treated him in that manner, neither with arrogance nor with timidity, but simply, with naturalness. As though his being a duke altered nothing about the order of that moment. And for the first time in his life, Edward Calloway found himself faintly surprised as he watched someone walk away. That brief encounter in Lady Hargrove's library occupied more space in Clara's thoughts than she cared to admit, even to herself. The Duke of Blackmore had affected her. The word was correct, but incomplete. A more precise expression would be this: he had surprised her. Because Clara had long noticed that nearly all the men in Devonshire's social sphere fell into certain patterns. Some spoke too much, some not at all, some only to hear themselves speak. But what had the Duke done in that library? He had simply listened. And the expression on his face as he watched Clara leave, was it surprise? Not quite. Rather, it was the subtle, involuntary attention of someone noticing that something was not where it ought to be. Clara asked herself why she made that distinction. Then she abandoned the question. She did not tell her mother about the encounter. If Eleanor had heard, Clara did not even wish to complete that scene in her mind. By mid-June, the air had changed. The cool Devonshire mornings grew warmer, the lavender in the garden bloomed, and the village's social calendar filled. Lady Pemberton's annual tea party was among the most established events, so established that receiving an invitation was little more than a formality. Everyone attended, everyone saw one another, and everyone measured how much each had changed since the previous year, or had not. Eleanor Ashworth considered this invitation particularly important. Because it was said that the Duke of Blackmore would also attend. "Wear the blue dress," she said over breakfast. "We are staying with it, it suits you well." "Mother, I wore the blue dress to the ball." "It makes no difference. The Duke may have seen it, but so have others, in a different context. it creates a different effect. Clara set down her teacup. Her mother's logic always felt both entirely correct and completely wrong. The social calculation was accurate, but the assumption beneath it, that everything must be done to secure that gaze, gave Clara a small yet sharp discomfort every time. "Very well," she said. The answer pleased her mother. Clara could read it on her face. Pemberton Manor, rising behind a long row of poplars on the southern edge of the village, was one of the most imposing structures in the region by sheer scale. Lady Pemberton, whose age no one knew precisely, though it was generally placed somewhere between 60 and 70, was both the ruler of this house and its oldest piece of furniture. She knew everything, remembered everything, and used everything when the time was right. Her politeness was genuine, but it had boundaries, and those boundaries aligned perfectly with social hierarchy. To her, a person's worth was determined by name and fortune. Everything else, intelligence, character, integrity, could only serve as pleasant embellishments once those two conditions had been met. Clara liked her. But with caution. The room that day was filled with 18 or 20 people. Clara stood beside her mother, near Lady Hargrove. Familiar faces surrounded her: Sir William Lucas, his voice a shade louder than usual, Miss Georgiana Vane, newly engaged, carrying her happiness into every corner of the room, Madame Duval, in her usual place, offering opinions uninvited. And in the corner, quietly, though not unnoticed, the Duke of Blackmore. Edward Calloway stood with the same distance about him. When people approached, he responded with courtesy but did not prolong conversation. He showed no particular interest in anyone. And on his face, Clara had noticed this before, there was always a faint trace of boredom. As if it was not the content of these gatherings that brought him there, but their obligation. Clara looked away. The moment the incident began was precisely when Madame Duval said something about the French Revolution. How the topic had arisen, Clara did not fully recall. Perhaps someone had mentioned Napoleon, perhaps recent developments in Europe. But Madame Duval, with her usual confidence, began speaking about the events of 1789. And what she said was wrong. Not entirely wrong, but partially so, delivered with certainty, presenting an incorrect date as fact. Clara thought, let it pass. It does not matter. No one cares. But Madame Duval continued. She expanded the error. Added another layer of commentary. And Clara, later, she could not fully explain why she did it. Perhaps letting the error stand gave her the sense that something within her had diminished. Perhaps she simply wished to state what was true, regardless of the room's reaction. As a matter of fact, Clara said, her voice calm, not intending to provoke noise, the fall of the Bastille occurred in July 1789, Madame Duval. Not April. And the transformation of the Third Estate into the National Assembly took place 3 weeks prior, which means the sequence unfolded in reverse, first the Assembly, then the fortress. The room fell silent. This was not the uncomfortable silence that follows a mistake. It was the silence of something unexpected, like a shift in the air, immediately felt but not easily explained. Madame Duval's face froze for a moment. Then it settled into a small smile, not defensive, but surprised. Lady Hargrove gave a faint cough. And then, the Duke of Blackmore, who until that moment had not participated in the conversation, stood by the window, a teacup in his hand, witnessing this small moment, Bastille, Madame Duval, Clara Ashworth, merely as an observer. He lowered his cup delicately onto its saucer. The movement was slow, almost deliberate. Then his voice rose, low, but clear, controlled enough to reach every corner of the room. Miss Ashworth's knowledge is truly remarkable. For a woman. A pause. That pause within the sentence, the small, calculated distance between remarkable and for a woman. Something existed there. Not merely a remark, but a boundary line, and the hand that drew it was the most powerful in the room. The room laughed. A few people, politely, softly, in a manner befitting Lady Pemberton's standards. Because it had been said by the Duke of Blackmore, and he was the one who set the tone. No one objected. No one raised their voice. Lady Pemberton intervened at once, with a gentle tone, precisely timed, like an experienced hostess. Yes, Clara has always been somewhat curious. A trait from her father, I believe. This sentence was deeper than the Duke's. Because the Duke had diminished, but Lady Pemberton had forgiven. And to be forgiven can be harder to bear than to be slighted. Because forgiveness implies error. It reframes something that did not wish to be corrected as though it already had been. Curious. A sweet word. Spoken with a diminishing meaning, wrapped in a pleasant tone. Clara's knowledge was thus reduced to a childish inclination, an odd habit inherited from her father, not a value, but a peculiarity. The room relaxed. The subject changed. Life went on. Clara smiled. Perhaps this was the most important detail, what Clara did in that moment. She did not cry. Her voice did not tremble. She did not flush with shame or stiffen with anger. She smiled. A calm, closed smile that gave nothing away. As though thanking Lady Pemberton, as though genuinely pleased by that gentleness, and she withdrew from the conversation. What lay within her at that moment? Anger? Yes, in part. But not warm, cold, sharp, patient. Not because she had been forced into silence. Not because she had been humiliated while being right. But rather this room, these people, these rules, they had always been this way and would remain so. And Clara already knew it. She had known, and still she had spoken. And for speaking, she had been corrected. So the question became, would she speak again? She finished her tea before answering it. When the party ended, Clara joined her mother. There was nothing on Eleanor Ashworth's face, neither anger nor sorrow. Only that familiar tension, now slightly hardened. The carriage ride home passed in silence. Clara looked outside. The poplars slipped past one by one. Madame Duval was mistaken, Clara said at last. A brief silence. I know, her mother replied. Nothing more was said. Because both understood that the real question was this, was it right, or was it wise? And in Clara's world, those two things did not always lead to the same door. Eleanor turned her head, casting a brief glance at her daughter. Then she faced forward again. What was in that glance? Disappointment? Concern? Clara could not fully distinguish it. Perhaps both. Perhaps neither, perhaps simply a mother confronting a truth in her daughter's world that she could not help her with, doing the only thing she could, sitting beside her in silence. That night, in her room, Clara opened her father's volume of Gibbon. She read, though the words did not fully settle. Her eyes moved across the page, but her mind remained in the drawing room. In the Duke's voice. In that pause, the small, calculated space between remarkable and for a woman. He had diminished her. That was clear. But how had he done so? With malice? Clara considered it. No, not precisely. Or rather, if there was malice, it was not deliberate. He had likely meant, in that moment, to be witty. To gather the room's attention. And the easiest tool at hand had been Clara's gender, because in that room, it was an assumption everyone believed they shared, a woman's knowledge was not the same as a man's. It was an unchallenged premise. Clara closed the book. What did she think of the Duke of Blackmore now? The answer should have been simple. But it was not. Because the man in the library and the man in the drawing room were the same, and yet, had Clara seen only one, she would never have guessed the other. The man who listened, who paid attention, who showed a trace of surprise, was that the same man who had said, "For a woman?" Yes. The same man. Clara wanted to understand this. Why? Because if people were singular, wholly good or wholly bad, wholly respectful or wholly dismissive, the world would be far simpler. But people were not singular. The Duke was not. And this was what troubled Clara most: simple hatred, simple dismissal, neither was possible. She extinguished the candle. In the darkness, she stared at the ceiling for a while. Then she closed her eyes. The Duke of Blackmoor had most likely gone to sleep that night without a second thought. Clara, on the other hand, would meet the morning slightly tired, for the mind, on certain nights, refuses rest. Because there remains within it an equation not yet resolved. A week passed. During that time, Clara saw the Duke twice, both at a distance, in situations that required no conversation. Once during a garden walk at Lady Hargrove's, and once outside the village church. In both instances, the Duke was looking elsewhere. Or perhaps choosing to. Clara did not attempt to determine which. Life, meanwhile, continued in its rhythm. Her mother sewed in the mornings, arranged visits in the afternoons, and in the evenings quietly calculated figures. Clara did not fully know what was being calculated, but when she looked at the papers on the table, she saw columns of numbers. The Ashworth household stood upon those numbers. Barely, but it stood. Clara continued to visit the library. She had finished the second volume of Gibbon and moved on to the third. Reading gave her a peculiar calm during this period. It did not silence her thoughts, but rather gave them direction. The night in Pemberton's drawing room still lingered within her, but from a less sharp place now. Like dust, suspended in the air, but no longer stinging the eyes. She arrived early at Hargrove's library that morning. The sky hung low, clouds moved slowly, and there was the scent of rain in the air, not yet fallen, but ready. The library was empty. Clara walked between the shelves, ran her finger along the spines, read a few titles. Then she sat, by the window, in her usual chair. She opened her book. She read. Half an hour later, the door opened. Clara lifted her head. The Duke of Blackmoor entered, alone again, with that ease uncommon to the people of the region, as though entering libraries were an ordinary act for him. He paused. Saw Clara. For a moment, only a moment, he hesitated slightly. Then he stepped inside. Clara returned to her book. She read, or pretended to read, because her eyes moving across the lines no longer absorbed anything. Footsteps approached. Stopped. The quiet reach of a hand toward the shelf, the soft selection of a book, the faint sound of it being drawn free. Then another voice, unexpected, low. What you said at Pemberton was correct. Clara did not turn the page. She lifted her head. The Duke was still looking at the shelf, a volume in his hand, holding it not to read but simply to hold. Then he turned. He met Clara's eyes, briefly, but without retreat. History. The Bastille. It was correct. Clara did not answer at once. The silence was not from uncertainty, she knew exactly what to say. But before speaking, she wanted to observe him for one moment longer. Because this was not an apology. An apology would have felt different, softer, less composed. This was closer to a statement of fact. As though he wished to settle something within himself, and had decided this was the most honest way to do so. I know, Clara said. Not harshly. Not politely. Simply as a fact, just as he had spoken. Edward Calloway had not expected that answer. Or rather, not that tone. Most people, at such a moment, would either express gratitude or condescension. They would become either indebted or defensive. Clara had done neither. She had simply said, "I know." And those two words, in a strange way, weighed more heavily on Edward than the laughter of 20 people in that drawing room. Because "I know" meant this: I knew I was right then as well. I knew the laughter was wrong. And I needed neither you nor anyone else to confirm it. Edward heard all of that, everything within the words. There was a silence. Not long, 5, perhaps 6 seconds. But it was full. Edward glanced at the book in his hand. Then returned it to the shelf. He had not chosen it to read, after all. He walked to the window, looked out into the garden. It had begun to rain, light, uncertain, the kind of morning rain particular to Devonshire. "Will you be taking this one as well?" he said, turning back. He meant the third volume, the one in Clara's hands. "I am only halfway through." "And how did you find the second volume?" Clara turned the book over, considering. "The second volume is stronger. In the first, Gibbon is still gathering his courage. In the second, he no longer hesitates to say what he knows. At times, one can almost sense that he takes pleasure in it. That confidence enters the writing." Edward looked at her. "I have not heard that observation before." "Because no one has asked, most likely." A pause. Then Edward, unexpectedly, laughed, briefly, genuinely, without performance. It was nothing like the controlled smile in Pemberton's drawing room. It was less guarded. More inward. Clara noted it, but did not show it. They remained in the library for another 40 minutes that morning. For 40 minutes, they spoke of Gibbon, of why Rome had fallen, of why historians recount the same event differently. And throughout that conversation, Clara noticed something. Edward Calloway listened. Truly. Not in order to speak, but simply to hear. This was something Clara had encountered very rarely in her life, particularly in conversations with men. But she noticed something else as well: he was intelligent. And this unsettled her, because it complicated everything. It would have been easier to attribute that sentence at Pemberton to ordinary arrogance, and that arrogance to an ordinary man, and to place him at the edge of her life. But Edward Calloway was not ordinary. And this made the question heavier: how could someone so intelligent have said such a thing? Perhaps intelligence and arrogance do not always stand at separate doors. Perhaps the more one knows, the longer it may take to recognize what one does not know. And perhaps Edward Calloway had never fully realized that women could think, because no one had ever shown him otherwise. This thought surprised Clara. Because, in some small way, it complicated her anger toward him. As they parted, Edward turned at the door. "When you have finished the third volume," he said, his voice unusually direct, "should be interested to hear what you think." Clara glanced at her shoes for a moment. Then lifted her head. "Then be in the library," she said. Edward said nothing. But before leaving, Clara could not quite define it. Something in his expression shifted. Small, quick, uncontrolled. Not the kind she had seen in Pemberton's drawing room. The door closed. Clara turned toward the window. The rain still fell. She opened her book. This time, she truly read. Yet a corner of her mind quietly arranged those 40 minutes, like an inventory: what had been said, how it had been said, where each pause had settled. This habit, of analyzing everything, of searching for the layer beneath, drove her mother to exasperation. "You think too much," she would say. "You need to feel, Clara. Not think." But Clara believed the two could not be separated. To feel was to think. To think was to feel. They did not lead to different doors, they moved within the same room, only one stepping forward at times. Which one stood forward now? Clara did not ask herself, because she did not yet wish to know. That evening, Eleanor Ashworth sat at her desk, writing a letter to Lady Hargrove, proposing a visit for the following week. Clara sat by the fire, a book in her hands, not reading, simply looking at the page. "I saw the Duke of Blackmore today," she said at last. Her mother's pen paused for a moment. Then continued. "Where?" "In Hargrove's library. We spoke." This time the pen stopped, and did not resume. Eleanor turned. There was that complex expression on her face, hope, concern, and question intertwined. What kind of conversation? Clara considered for a moment. Searched for the right word. Then, "Unexpected," she said. Eleanor did not know what to do with that answer. She wanted to say something, Clara could read it on her face. But in the end, she remained silent, perhaps because she could not find the right question, or because she sensed the answer was not yet ready. She took up her pen again. Returned to her letter. Clara looked into the fire. The flames were small, steady, orderly. Outside, the rain continued, now stronger, more certain. Devonshire rains were like that. Once they began, they did not easily end. And as Clara held her father's book in her lap, she recognized something in a quiet corner of her mind: she would see Edward Calloway again. This was not hope. Nor was it concern. It was simply a fact, like the rain not stopping, like her mother's figures laid out on the table each evening, like the certainty of the sun rising in the morning. But within that fact, there was something else, very small, very quiet. Clara did not name it. Not yet. Devonshire was a small place. That meant many things, but most importantly this: when something happened, everyone learned of it. And even if nothing had happened, if enough people looked in the same direction, then something might as well have. From that morning in Hargrove's library onward, the fact that Clara and the Duke of Blackmore had been seen in the same room twice, first at the ball, then in the library, began to take on a small but definite shape in the social mind of Devonshire. No one said anything outright. But looks had changed. There were small pauses in conversations. And the visits to Eleanor Ashworth had increased noticeably over the past 2 weeks. None of these visits were for Clara. They all came for Eleanor, but in each of them, sooner or later, the conversation curved toward the Duke of Blackmore. Politely. With elegant curiosity. If it were possible to ask without asking, that was precisely how it was done. Lady Hargrove came one afternoon. They had tea, spoke of the garden, of the region's weather. Then Lady Hargrove set down her cup and said, "I hear the Duke will remain at Meryton at least until August. Perhaps longer. Is that so?" Eleanor said, controlling the tremor in her voice with precision. "So they say. At his mother's insistence, I believe. Or perhaps he has taken a liking to this part of the country." A brief pause. One wonders what, precisely, he has taken a liking to. Clara appeared occupied with her sewing. But she heard every word. After Lady Hargrove left, the room remained quiet for a while. Eleanor rose, went to the window, and looked out into the garden. It was something she did when thinking, as though distance helped her see more clearly. Clara had known this since childhood. Whenever her mother went to the window, she knew something important was about to be said. "Clara," Eleanor said, still facing outward. "Yes, mother." "What do you think of the Duke of Blackmore?" Clara set aside her sewing. She had expected the question, but not quite in this form, not so directly. Her mother usually approached things indirectly. This directness revealed the weight of what she carried. "He is intelligent," Clara said carefully. "And complex." "Complex?" Eleanor turned. What do you mean? The man who said what he said at Pemberton, and the man I spoke to in the library, they are the same person. Yet I cannot understand those two versions of him at once. Eleanor watched her for a moment. Then came and sat opposite her. Her voice lowered, the tone reserved for her most serious conversations. Clara, I must speak to you honestly. Clara waited. You know the condition of this house. Your father's debts are still here, reduced, yes, but not gone. As I grow older, it will become more difficult to keep this house standing. I have carried it for 10 years. I did not wish to burden you with it, but it would no longer be honest to remain silent. She folded her hands in her lap. Her fingers intertwined, the kind of unconscious gesture formed by habit. If the Duke of Blackmore is showing you interest, and I believe he is, because he does not go to that library by accident, then you must take it seriously. Not only for my sake. For your own future. A pause. Then, more quietly, almost as if speaking to herself. I could not give you better than this, Clara. I wish I could have. But making good use of what one has, that, too, is a virtue. Clara looked at her mother. The expression she recognized, that fear always present, was now more visible. More exposed. And Clara, who loved her, knew that beneath that vulnerability lay something genuine, real affection. Misguided at times, sometimes suffocating, but real. It made her answer more difficult. Mother, Clara said slowly, I hear you. And I do not take the matter of the house lightly, you know that. Eleanor inclined her head, slightly. But I must also say this, I will not run toward the Duke of Blackmore. If anything is to happen with this man, then it will be on my terms. An equal conversation. Equal respect. Not by erasing what he said at Pemberton, but by facing it. Eleanor's expression tightened. Facing it? Clara, this is a duke. I know who he is. Then you must know that such conditions. Mother. Clara did not raise her voice. But there was something in it, calm, firm, immovable. If his interest depends on my silence, on my submission, then he is already interested in the wrong person. And that would not be a sound foundation, not for me, nor for the house. Silence. Eleanor looked down at her fingertips. For a long while, she said nothing. Then, very quietly. You are your father's daughter. It was not an accusation. Not quite an observation. More, an acceptance. Like acknowledging something inevitable that had long been understood, but was only now being spoken aloud. Clara did not respond. It required no response. Within that week, Clara saw the Duke again at Lady Vane's garden gathering. This time the setting was different, open air, a more relaxed assembly, without the formal weight of Lady Pemberton's drawing room. People were dispersed in small groups, some walked along the flower beds, others sat in the shade. Clara was speaking with Miss Vane when she noticed the Duke approaching, not directly, but along a side path, and with intent. Miss Vane noticed as well. She smiled, that familiar, knowing Devonshire smile. Duke Blackmore, she said, inclining her head slightly. What a pleasant coincidence. A coincidence? Edward replied, stopping. His eyes were on Clara. I would not quite call it that. Miss Vane was about to say something, but then, as if sensing the situation, suddenly found reason to greet someone at a distance and withdrew with an apology. Such an obvious retreat made Clara want both to laugh and to feel uneasy, at once. Edward came closer. Not at her shoulder, a few steps away, but near enough for conversation. Have you finished, Gibbon? 2 chapters remain. You have slowed. I have been occupied. Edward glanced toward the garden. Two ladies passed by a flower bed, both looking in their direction, pretending not to, but looking nonetheless. Edward noticed. Clara noticed as well. They are watching us, Edward said evenly. They have been watching for a week, Clara replied. Edward turned to her. Does that trouble you? Clara considered. She wanted to be honest. It does not trouble me. But it requires me to be careful. Why careful? Because, Clara said, her gaze fixed beyond the garden, they are writing a story. And I wish to decide for myself which role I occupy within it. Edward was silent for a moment. Then, in a lower voice. And which role do you wish to play? Clara turned. She looked at him, directly, without retreat, with the same calm composure she had held in Pemberton's drawing room. My own, she said. Not one written by someone else. That evening, as Edward rode back to Meryton Park through the long Devonshire twilight, he thought of Clara Ashworth. The act of thinking itself was unusual for him, to consider a woman in this way, with such layers. The women around him were usually either easily understood or unwilling to be understood. Clara was neither. She wished to be understood, but on her own terms. And those terms were unlike any he had encountered before. He thought of the sentence he had spoken at Pemberton. For a woman. Why had he said it? Looking back, he had wanted to gather the room's attention. To be clever. And the easiest instrument at hand had been a shared assumption, something everyone believed, something no one questioned. He had used it. Quickly, without thought. But Clara had not let it pass. She had not let it pass because, for her, it had not been a jest, it had been a boundary line. And that line had made visible something Edward had never truly examined, how empty that assumption was. Remarkable, for a woman. But what exactly was remarkable? That she knew the date of the Bastille? Would that be remarkable in a man? No. Then what was remarkable was that she was a woman. And if that was remarkable, if the act of thinking in a woman remained surprising, then where, precisely, was the flaw? Edward rode on in the twilight, carrying that question. He did not yet know the answer. But the act of asking, that, in itself, was something. Because Edward Calloway had questioned very little in his life. Everything he possessed, title, land, wealth, social standing, had been given to him. And what is given is rarely questioned. To question feels like ingratitude. But the look in Clara's eyes, direct, calm, immovable, told him something else, that questioning was not ingratitude. It was honesty. When the lights of Meryton appeared, Edward slowed his horse. Above the village, the first star had emerged. The library. Tomorrow. The third volume of Gibbon. He wished to know what Clara thought, not of the book. But the book was the only place he knew to begin. That night, Clara did not sleep either, but it was a different kind of sleeplessness. Not from anger. Not from questions. Rather, from the quiet, unavoidable weight of recognizing that something had shifted. Life sometimes moved in this way, silently, without a single defining moment, things rearranged themselves. And then one day you looked, and everything appeared the same as weeks before, yet you were different. What did Clara feel? She wanted to be careful. This was not fear, Clara knew fear, in others, and in herself. This was more like standing at the edge, measuring the depth of water before stepping in. Wanting to know before leaping. Because once one leapt, returning was not always possible. And yet, and it took her some time to admit this even to herself, she kept thinking of Edward Calloway's question in the garden. Which role do you wish to play? Someone who asked such a question cared about the answer. Or at least wished to care. And this was unfamiliar in Clara's life, because no one had asked her that before. Her mother's questions were different. What will you wear? How will you appear? What impression will you make? All of them came from the outside. Edward's came from within. Clara extinguished the candle. In the darkness, without seeing the ceiling, she thought this, perhaps being careful was not the same as closing the door entirely. Perhaps being careful meant stepping through an open door, eyes open. When she thought this, something within her, very small, very new, stirred. Clara did not name it. But this time, she did not say not yet. Clara finished the final 2 chapters of Gibbon's 3rd volume in 2 days. Normally, she did not read so quickly. She preferred to absorb each page, linger over a sentence, make notes in the margins of her mind, sometimes read the same paragraph 3 times. But this time was different. As she read, a question remained in the corner of her mind: would she go to the library once she had finished? And if she did, would Edward be there? The presence of these questions unsettled her, because turning a book into the means of something else was perhaps the worst thing one could do to it. Yet she had to admit, honestly, her pace had quickened. And that meant something. On the morning she finished the final page, she rested her hand on the cover for a moment. The fall of Rome, centuries of accumulated decisions, neglect, arrogance, small concessions yielding vast consequences. Gibbon had not written it as a lament, but as a diagnosis. And within that diagnosis, what Clara found anew each time was this: great things do not collapse in great moments. They collapse in small ones. In unnoticed, seemingly insignificant, easily dismissed moments. She closed the book. Looked out the window. The sky was clear. She went to Hargrove's library. Edward was there. This did not surprise Clara, and yet, something small stirred within her. She tried not to notice it. She succeeded, in part. The man was seated in the armchair by the window, a book in his hand, but the page had not been turned when Clara entered. Which meant he had either just begun, or was not reading at all. Both were possible. Both suggested something. Edward lifted his head. "You finished." It was not a question, a statement. He had seen the volume in Clara's hand. This morning. Clara walked to the shelf and returned the book. Then, without turning, still looking at the spines, "You said you would be here." "And I am." "Yes." She turned. Edward was still watching her. The distance between them, 5, perhaps 6 steps, felt to Clara both too much and too little at once. She sat in the chair opposite him. "How did you find it?" Edward asked. Clara considered. There was no hurry. She knew now that Edward would listen. She had learned that in their first conversation in the library. That certainty made her answer more honest. "The 3rd volume is the heaviest," she said. "Here, Gibbon is no longer merely recounting history, he is judging it. And within those judgments, at times, his own anger seeps through. I do not think that is a weakness, but one must read carefully. Because when a historian grows angry, he may begin to seek not the truth, but his own justification." Edward set the book in his lap. "Where did you learn that observation?" "I did not learn it. I thought it." "Are those not the same?" "They are not. To learn is to take another's thought. To think is to produce one's own. The former is faster, the latter more reliable, though the latter requires much of the former first. It appears a paradox, but it is not." Edward looked at her, long, attentively, as though measuring something. "When you speak like this," he said slowly, "what do people usually do?" Clara gave a small laugh, genuine, brief. "They change the subject. Or they continue speaking not with me, but as though about me. What an interesting girl, they say. As if I were not present. A silence followed. Edward lowered his head slightly, a small, almost imperceptible movement. But Clara noticed. At Pemberton, I did the same, Edward said. Clara did not answer immediately. Then. Yes. And an apology would not suffice. No, Clara said. It would not. But understanding, truly understanding why it was wrong, that is worth more than an apology. Edward looked out the window. The garden lay beyond, calm, sunlit, unaware. He remained silent for a long while. Clara did not interrupt. The silence was full, the kind in which something is working itself out. Then Edward turned back. My father taught me, he said, and for the first time his voice slipped slightly beyond its usual control, that a Calloway is never wrong. And if he is, then he is not considered to have erred. Because the title erases the mistake. He paused. I believed that for a long time. Because everyone around me believed it. No one corrected me, no one dared. When I sought to silence you at Pemberton, it came from that habit. Without thought, as a reflex. I know, Clara said. That does not make you less responsible. No. It does not. He did not avert his gaze. But at least now, I see it. Clara felt the weight of that admission, not physically, but undeniably real. Because such an admission was not easy. Not from this man, in this position, within this society. For Edward Calloway to say it meant that something within him had shifted. And Clara knew when that shift had begun, in the library, the first time she had said I know. From there, the conversation moved elsewhere, deeper, easier, the kind in which two people begin to discover one another's language. Edward spoke of London, its crowds, its endless evenings spent among the same faces in the same rooms. Everyone wants something, he said. And they do not say what they want, they believe not saying it is a form of refinement. But beneath that refinement, there is only calculation. Pure calculation. Is Devonshire so different? Clara asked. The calculations are smaller. That sometimes feels more honest, and sometimes less. Clara understood. Large calculations at least command respect. Small ones merely exhaust. Edward laughed, this time longer, freer. And when Clara heard it, something stirred within her, something she could not quite name. It was a pleasant thing, but its very pleasantness unsettled her. Because pleasant things made caution more difficult. Clara shifted the subject. Why Gibbon? She asked. It is not a book I would expect a duke to read. Why did you not expect it? Because Gibbon asks uncomfortable questions. He asks why greatness collapses. Those who possess greatness do not usually enjoy that question. Edward looked at her. Then, very quietly. Perhaps that is precisely why I read him. When Hargrove's servant opened the door, Clara realized how far the afternoon had advanced. More than 2 hours had passed. This surprised her. It had felt like far less. She rose. Edward rose as well, at the same moment, as though remaining seated were no longer possible. I must go, Clara said. I know. She walked to the door. Paused, not turning, but speaking back. There is a 4th volume of Gibbon. A brief silence. Then Edward's voice, low, careful, carrying something faint within it. I know. Clara left. Out on the street, as she stepped beyond Hargrove's door, the air struck her face, fresh, slightly cool, with that fleeting chill of midsummer. She walked. Without thinking, or rather, she thought, but without ordering her thoughts, letting them move as they wished. This was unusual for Clara. Normally she arranged them, one before the other, in careful sequence. But now there was no order. There was something that unsettled her. What, precisely, had happened in those 2 hours? They had spoken. Of books, of history, of London, of calculation. Ordinary things, from an external view. But they had not been experienced externally, they had been lived from within. And from within, the conversation had not felt ordinary at all. Edward Calloway had listened. Not only that, he had responded. Truly responded, with his own thought, his own doubt, his own vulnerability. That sentence about his father, "A Calloway is never wrong," how far inward had he needed to look to say that aloud? And here was the realization Clara reached that day: Edward Calloway could change. This was not hope, hope was uncertain, this was more concrete. In their 3 conversations, he had taken a step each time. Small steps, but real. And real steps felt entirely different from performative ones. Clara had seen enough of the latter to know the difference. But caution was still necessary. Because between the ability to change and actual change, there lay an entire life. And Clara did not wish to surrender herself simply because she had seen the possibility. When she saw that it had happened, truly, permanently, not only in relation to her but in his relation to the world, then perhaps. When she arrived home, her mother stood in the middle of the drawing room, waiting. This was unusual. Eleanor was usually at her sewing or her desk, not waiting at the door, not making her waiting visible. But today, she was there. Clara stopped. They looked at one another. "Where have you been?" Eleanor asked. "In Hargrove's library." "For more than 2 hours." "Yes." Eleanor's eyes searched Clara's face, long, carefully, with that deep reading skill a mother develops over thousands of conversations. And beneath that gaze, Clara felt that something showed on her face, something she could not hide, something she did not yet fully understand herself. Eleanor stepped closer. Her voice lowered. "Was he there?" Clara paused briefly. Then, "Yes." Several things passed across Eleanor's face at once: relief, concern, perhaps even a silent prayer. They could not be fully distinguished. Then they settled into silence. Not the silence of a mother eager to marry off her daughter, but the silence of a mother who, for the first time, sees this expression on her child's face. She passed by Clara and went toward the kitchen. "I shall make tea," she said, her back turned. This was what Eleanor did when she wished to conceal emotion, to occupy her hands. Clara knew this. And today, that knowledge both amused her and tightened something within her. She removed her coat. Sat down. Looked out at the garden. Outside, the lavender shifted gently in the breeze, so gently that it was difficult to tell whether it moved at all. It existed in that uncertain, delicate space between stillness and motion. Clara thought it was a metaphor. Then she stopped thinking. The tea would come. Her mother would come. And perhaps, for this evening alone, it was enough to sit without explaining, to watch the uncertain sway of the lavender. Some things, before they turn into words, are simply felt. Clara allowed it. In the final week of July, the air in Devonshire changed. The heat rose, humid, heavy, unmoving. The flowers in the garden lost their color, the paths turned to dust, and people began visiting one another more frequently, as though crowds made the heat more bearable. Or perhaps the heat made people more talkative, patience thinning, filters weakening. In either case, the result was the same: gossip increased. And at the center of that gossip, more clearly with each passing day, stood Clara Ashworth and the Duke of Blackmore. The meetings in the library were no longer a secret. Hargrove's servant had seen them, Lady Hargrove herself had seen them, and everything Lady Hargrove saw reached every tea table in Devonshire within 48 hours. The conversation at the garden gathering was known. And that moment after church last Sunday, when they thought they spoke unnoticed, that, too, had been seen. Devonshire assembled these fragments and constructed a story. The story was this: the Duke of Blackmore was interested in Miss Ashworth. Miss Ashworth was encouraging it. A proposal would soon follow. The Ashworth household would be saved. Was this story true? Partially. But partial truths are more dangerous than complete falsehoods, because they cannot be easily corrected. The first real pressure came from Lady Hargrove. It was a morning visit, informal, yet deliberate. As she drank her tea, she waited for Clara to set aside her sewing. Then, in her usual gentle yet precise tone, she began. "My dear Clara, I must ask you something. As a mother would, that is, honestly." Clara waited. "This correspondence, these meetings with the Duke of Blackmore, whatever we are to call it, where is it going? Or rather, where do you intend it to go?" "I do not yet know," Clara said. It was the truth. "I do not know," Lady Hargrove repeated, as though trying to place the answer somewhere. "Clara, this man is a duke. The Duke of Blackmore. His family is among the most established in London. His mother is Lady Catherine. Anyone who knows her knows she is not an easy woman. And you," she paused. Politely, but plainly. "You are an Ashworth. From Devonshire. Fatherless, of modest standing. I know all this. Then you must also know that such a difference closes certain doors. If the Duke's interest is genuine, and if it is to lead somewhere serious, then one must play very carefully. One misstep, one error, and this story will place you not at its center, but inside a rumor that destroys you." Clara set down her cup. Her voice remained calm, reflective. "Lady Hargrove, I hear you. And I know your intentions are kind. But I must ask, when you say I must play carefully, do you mean I must be careful for my own sake, or that I must behave according to society's expectations?" Lady Hargrove's brows lifted slightly. "At times, my dear, those two must be the same." "Yes," Clara said. "At times. But not always." After Lady Hargrove left, Eleanor entered the room. She had been standing behind the door. It was unclear how much she had heard. But her face suggested she had heard everything. Clara waited. Eleanor sat down. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers intertwined, that habitual gesture. But this time, they trembled slightly. Clara saw it, and something tightened within her. "Clara, Lady Hargrove is right. In some things. In most." Eleanor drew a breath. "The state of this house is no longer something we can postpone. The final portion of your father's debts comes due this winter. And I have done what I could, Clara. For years, I have done it. But now, a solution is required." She paused. Her eyes filled, but she did not cry. It was the kind of fullness Eleanor Ashworth allowed, moisture held within the eyes, never falling. "The Duke of Blackmore is interested in you. That is a fact. And you are interested in him, I see it, do not deny it. Then why resist? Why conditions, why boundaries, why make so difficult something that could be so simple?" Clara looked at her mother. Within her, two things existed at once, a deep sorrow for her mother, and that immovable resolve for herself. They clashed. But clashing did not mean one must destroy the other. "Mother," Clara said, her voice low but steady, "if I marry a duke only to settle the debts of this house, then that marriage will serve neither me, nor you, nor him. Because it will be founded on a lie. And a house built on a lie collapses far sooner than a house in debt. Eleanor's jaw trembled. She wanted to speak, Clara saw it. But she could not. Because Clara was right, and Eleanor knew it. And knowing is sometimes the heaviest burden of all. Then what will you do? Eleanor asked, very quietly. I will find my own path, Clara said. But it will be mine. That afternoon, Clara went out into the garden, alone, without a hat, without hearing her mother's protest. She walked. Without direction, she only wanted movement, because something within her required it. Emotion sometimes worked this way. It did not wish to sit, did not wish to think, only to feel the ground beneath one's feet. The small road of Devonshire led to the edge of the village, where fields began and the sounds of the house faded. When Clara reached it, she stopped. There was wind, warm, but real, striking her face. And there, on that empty road, she was honest with herself. She wanted Edward Calloway. There was no longer any use denying it, neither to herself nor to the empty road. She wanted him because he listened. Because in the library he had spoken of his father as he had. Because he had not defended his mistake at Pemberton, but tried to understand it. Because he read Gibbon, because he truly wished to know why Rome had fallen, and because within that curiosity he had begun to question even his own greatness. It was enough. It was more than enough. But enough was not the same as surrender. Clara knew that. If she ran toward him, as her mother wished, as Devonshire expected, as the story demanded, then what she gained would not be a duke. She would become a woman who had lost herself. And a woman who has lost herself can never be truly content beside any man. This was the one truth Clara believed down to her bones. So what would she do? She would wait. But not passively, not idly. She would wait standing, aware, remaining herself. She would not wait for Edward to come toward her, but for them both to arrive somewhere together. And if that place never came, if Edward did not complete that transformation, if the man from Pemberton consumed the man from the library, then she would close the door. With pain, but she would close it. When she reached this decision, something within her loosened. It was small, but real. On her way back, she met Edward. Was it coincidence? Clara did not know. He was on horseback, moving slowly, coming from the direction of the village, though he ought to have been returning to Meryton. Which meant either he had taken the wrong road, or... They both stopped. Looked at one another. Walking? Edward said, dismounting, though Clara had not asked. To think. About what? Clara looked at him for a moment. Then decided, because honesty had become the only possible language between them. About you. About this. And about what I want. Edward held the reins of his horse. He was silent, but not the kind of silence that waits to speak. The kind that listens. And, he said at last. Clara stood straight. Her voice neither soft nor sharp, simply true. I will not run toward you, Edward. Not because my mother wishes it, not because this village expects it, not because you are a duke. If this is to go somewhere between us, then we must arrive there together. In equal steps. Not you ahead of me, nor I behind you. A pause. Then she continued, her voice lowering slightly, but the force within it growing. I have not forgotten what you said at Pemberton. Nor will I. But I have also seen the man in the library, the one who spoke of his father, who truly reads Gibbon, who can admit he is wrong. If that man is who you are, if Pemberton was the accident, and the library is the truth, then I wish to continue speaking. But if Pemberton is who you are, and the library was only a moment. She stopped. Then, clearly. Then let it end here. The wind moved between them. A bird called somewhere in the distance. The road lay empty. Edward Calloway, on that road, saw something in Clara Ashworth's eyes, something he had never seen in his life. Neither desire nor rejection. Neither hope nor fear. Only truth. And that truth asked something of him, not performance, not calculation, not title. Only honesty. Edward took a step forward. He did not release the reins of his horse, but his voice changed. It slipped beyond its usual control, and this time he did not draw it back. The library is who I am. Pemberton was an accident, but I know that being an accident does not erase it. You did not ask me to erase it. You asked me to understand it. He paused. And I did. Late. But I did. Clara looked at him. Long, attentive, calm. Something within her, that small, unnamed thing, did not stir this time. It settled. As though something had been falling and had come to rest. That sound, firm, real, the sound of something finding its place. But Clara did not smile. Not yet. Because honesty, understanding, acknowledgement, these were beginnings. They were good, important, real. But who a person is cannot be known in a single roadside conversation, it is revealed across days, weeks, years. Clara knew this. And that knowledge did not restrain her feeling, it refined it. Then, Clara said, turning and beginning to walk toward home, her voice carrying behind her in that quiet, measured tone, the 4th volume of Gibbon is still in the library. Edward watched her. He smiled, genuine, unguarded, unlike anything seen in Pemberton's drawing room. Tomorrow, he said. Tomorrow. Clara walked on. She did not look back. But her steps were lighter, lighter than they had been in weeks. As though she had left something behind on the road, not her mother's fear, not Devonshire's expectations. Only the weights that were not her own. Those remained there. Clara went home. That evening, Eleanor sat at her desk, accounts spread before her, pen in hand, but she was not writing. Only looking. Clara came beside her. Saturday. Said nothing. Eleanor said nothing either. They sat in silence for a time, two women at the same table, within the same house, carrying different burdens. Yet carrying them side by side. Then Eleanor set down her pen. Looked at Clara's hand. For a moment, only a moment, she placed her own hand over it. She did not grasp it, did not hold it. Only placed it there. Clara did not withdraw her hand. Outside, Devonshire's night settled, that long, deep, star-filled summer night. The lavender was no longer visible, but its scent drifted inward through the half-open window. And that night, for the first time, Clara slept without thinking. In the first week of August, Devonshire slowed. The heat eased, not abruptly, but gradually, as though summer itself had grown tired and wished to rest. Mornings cooled, evenings lengthened, and the village's social calendar paused. Invitations diminished, visits shortened, people remained in their gardens or their homes. Devonshire sometimes breathed this way, after crowds, silence, after silence, crowds again. Clara used the quiet well. She took up the 4th volume of Gibbon. Began to read. And this time, she read slowly, without haste, because the reason for haste had gone. The meetings in the library continued, but their rhythm had changed. Less performative, less guarded, neither of them now watched what they said, they simply said it. This difference was the most important thing Clara noticed. Because not having to watch one's words in another's presence, that is the simplest definition of trust. And Clara had not given that trust cheaply. It had been built over weeks, step by step, tested, observed. Or perhaps more precisely, it had been earned. By both of them, together. Edward was changing in that time, but not in any grand, dramatic way. In small, difficult to detect, cumulative ways. One day in the library, Clara saw Lady Hargrove's son James enter and address her in that familiar tone, faintly dismissive, one she had heard many times before. The tone that said remarkable, for a woman, in different words. Edward heard it as well. He turned to James. His voice was low, but with that same authority that could quiet a room. Miss Ashworth has read Gibbon better than you, James. Take that as an observation, and as advice. James flushed. Muttered something. Left. Silence remained. Clara looked at Edward. Edward looked at his book, as though he had said nothing of consequence, as though it were merely an ordinary reflex. But Clara knew, it was not ordinary. A month before, he had been the one to begin the laughter. Now he was the one to stop it. She said nothing. Did not thank him, because gratitude would frame it as a favor. It was not a favor. It was simply right. And doing what is right does not require thanks. But within her, that settled thing, that firm, real feeling, deepened. The proposal did not come as Clara might once have expected. There was no grand scene. No kneeling, no prepared speech, no moment witnessed by all of Devonshire. That was what Clara might have unconsciously expected, because that is how stories are told, how they live in society's memory. But Edward Calloway, as Clara had come to understand, was not a man who did what was expected. It happened in Hargrove's library, in mid-August, on a rainy afternoon. Outside, rain fell, as it had in the beginning, but stronger. The windows were misted. The library was dim, lamps lit. Clara was reading the final section of the 4th volume. Edward sat opposite her, looking not at his book, but at her. Clara turned the page. Then lifted her head. Their eyes met. "Why are you looking at me?" she asked. Edward paused. Then. "Because there is something I must say, and I do not know how to say it." Clara closed the book. Waited. Edward did not stand. Did not kneel. He simply leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his voice less controlled than ever before, less like a duke, more like a man. "Speaking with you is unlike anything else in my life. That is not a compliment, it is a fact. In trying to understand you, I have begun to understand myself. That, too, is a fact." He paused. Did not look away. "What I did at Pemberton was wrong. I said so in the library, but words are not enough, I know that. Because this is not something said once and forgotten. It must be carried, every day, in every conversation, in every room. And I wish to carry it. Not because you force me to be better, that is not the word. Because when I see you, I wish to be better. You understand the difference." A brief silence. Then, more quietly, as if speaking to someone alone. "I want to spend my life with you. In equal steps, as you said. Not me ahead, not you behind. I can promise that. Not perfection, but that I will wish to see my own faults." And then, very softly. "Is that enough?" Clara looked at him. With that long, attentive gaze she had formed over weeks. And what did she feel? This, it was enough. No, more than enough. Because what was offered was not perfection. It was honesty. And honesty was the only thing Clara had ever truly wanted, from her mother, from society, and now from this man. But she did not smile. Not yet. Because something had to be said. "Edward," Clara said. For the first time, she spoke his name, simply, without title, without formality. That small act was large for them both. I hear you. And I believe you, for today. But there is a difference between for today and for always. You know that. I do. Then know this as well, I trust you. Today. In this library, beneath this rain, within this conversation, I trust you. And that trust was not easily given, not by me, nor by you. Edward lowered his head slightly. There was something in his waiting, not childish, but unguarded. And that unguardedness was the most honest thing Clara had seen in him. For always, Clara continued, her voice softening though what lay within it grew stronger, I wish to trust you as well. That requires time. And patience. From us both. A pause. Then, and this was among the freest decisions Clara had ever made. But yes. Edward looked at her. For a moment, he did not move, as though he needed to be certain he had heard. Then something changed in his face, slowly, unguardedly. The familiar composure dissolved. Beneath it, Clara saw clearly for the first time, was weariness. A long-carried, hidden weariness. And now, it was being set down. Carefully, as one sets something fragile in a safe place. Edward laughed. Quietly, briefly, truly. There is a fifth volume of Gibbon, he said. Clara laughed as well, freely, openly, nothing like the sound heard in Pemberton's drawing room. There was lightness in it, the lightness that comes when something long carried is finally released. I know, she said. And that I know, the word she had carried throughout the story, felt different now. Before, it had been defense, boundary, stillness. Now, it was an opening. The same word, from an entirely different place. The news spread through Devonshire, but this time, Clara did not care. When Eleanor Ashworth heard the news that evening, through Lady Hargrove, as always, for Lady Hargrove was always the first to know, she stood in the middle of the drawing room. For a long while, she said nothing. Then she sat. Placed her hands in her lap. And wept, quietly, with a long-suppressed, complicated grief. Was it joy, relief, or the bittersweet acceptance that her daughter had found a path different from her own? It was all of them. All at once. When Clara returned home, she found her mother like this. She sat beside her. Took her hand, this time, she took it. Held it. Did not let go. Mother. Eleanor lifted her head. Her eyes were red, but there was something in her face, something Clara had never seen before. Lightness. The lightness that comes when something long carried has finally been set down. I remember your father, Eleanor said softly. When we first met, the first thing he asked me was what I read. It felt strange at the time, no man had ever asked me that. Then I understood, it was his language. His way of knowing me. She paused. Did the Duke ask you? About reading? From the very first day, Clara said. Eleanor lowered her head. Smiled, very faintly, the kind of smile that passes through the residue of an old pain. Then it is well, she said. Then it is well. The wedding took place in October. It was not grand, Clara did not wish it, and Edward did not insist. It was held in Hargrove's garden, beneath leaves turning gold, among a close circle. Lady Pemberton attended, politely, somewhat surprised, but she came. Madame Duval came as well. Sir William Lucas too. Devonshire, at last, accepted the story, because the Duke of Blackmore had accepted it, and what the Duke of Blackmore accepted, Devonshire did not contest. The irony made Clara smile. Quietly, to herself. Standing beside Edward during the ceremony, Clara allowed herself a moment to look around. Her mother's face. Lady Hargrove's smile. The yellowing poplars. In the distance, on the rise, the roof of Meryton Park. This happiness had not been given. It was not because of class, nor beauty, nor timing and chance, or not only because of them. It had been earned. Through weeks of walking through library doors, of saying I know, of standing firm in roadside conversations. And what is earned is different from what is given, heavier, truer, more enduring. Edward lowered his voice, whispering so that only Clara could hear, in the midst of the ceremony. We shall read the 5th volume together. Clara laughed, truly, freely, that sound. So different from the polite laughter in Pemberton's drawing room that it was almost difficult to believe it came from the same woman. And yet it did. Only now, it was her own voice. Years later, in the great library of Blackmore, truly vast this time, lined wall to wall with shelves, with multiple copies of every volume, Clara, reading one afternoon, looked up to see Edward enter through the door. He paused. Held a book in his hand. Looked at her. What are you reading? Tacitus. Edward smiled. Better than Gibbon? Clara considered. Different. Gibbon interprets. Tacitus observes. They are separate skills. Edward came closer, sat opposite her. Opened his own book. Read. There was silence, but it resembled that first silence in the library. Two people, in the same room, speaking the same language without speaking. This kind of silence was worth more than many conversations. After a while, Edward looked up. I still think of what I said at Pemberton sometimes, he said. With embarrassment. Clara turned a page. Then, her voice steady, without weight. So do I. But now I think of something else, how that moment brought us here. Edward looked at her. Long, warm, with that unguarded gaze. Would it have been better if I had never said it? Clara closed her book. Thought, truly, honestly. Then. I do not know. Perhaps without that sentence, you would never have questioned anything. Perhaps I would never have resisted. Perhaps we would never have had this conversation. A pause. But this I know, that you are here despite that sentence. And that is far more valuable than being here because of it. Edward watched her for a while. Then, quietly. I love you, Clara. Clara smiled. That smile, calm, real, concealing nothing. The opposite of the one in Pemberton. That had been a shield. This was simply a door, open, entirely. I know, she said. And this time, that final, complete, earned I know, they both laughed. At once. In the same room, within the same silence. Outside, the gardens of Blackmore were entering autumn. Leaves were falling, but it was not an end. As Clara had learned in Devonshire, everything was a cycle, things fall, so that they may bloom again. Clara opened her book once more. Tacitus was waiting. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this story. If you're still here, we would truly love to know where you're watching from. Reading your comments is one of the most meaningful parts of what we do. And if you'd like more stories like this, told with the same care and depth, don't forget to subscribe.